Marcus Thompson's fingers tapped nervously on his truck's steering wheel as he pulled into the visitors' parking lot of Riverside Elementary School. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:47 a.m., perfect timing for his son's lunch period. He hadn't told Jamal he was coming. The surprise visit was a small attempt to make up for missing breakfast with his son that morning. Working two jobs meant Marcus often had to choose between being present and putting food on the table. The morning shift at the warehouse had ended early today, giving him just enough time to see his son before heading to his evening security job. These rare moments were precious, like finding gold in a river of endless workdays. As he walked through the school's main entrance, Marcus straightened his warehouse uniform. It wasn't fancy, but he wore it with pride. The front office lady, Mrs. Peters, looked up from her computer with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear that unscheduled visits weren't her favorite part of the job. "I'm Marcus Thompson, Jamal Thompson's father," he said, pulling out his ID. "I was hoping to surprise him during lunch." The mention of Jamal's name softened Mrs. Peters' expression slightly. Jamal had that effect on people. His son's natural charm and good manners often opened doors that might otherwise stay closed. "Sign here, please," she said, pushing forward the visitor's log. Lunch period started 5 minutes ago. Fifth graders eat in the cafeteria down the hall, but they're allowed to visit their classrooms if they need to get something. Marcus signed his name carefully, accepted the visitor's badge, and followed the arrows pointing toward the cafeteria. The school hallways looked smaller than he remembered from back-to-school night. Children's artwork lined the walls. Fall trees made from construction paper handprints, science fair posters, and creative writing assignments proudly displayed. He paused at one of the writing assignments, scanning for Jamal's name. His son loved writing stories, filling notebook after notebook with adventures and mysteries. But Jamal had been quieter lately about school, changing the subject whenever Marcus asked about his classes. At first, Marcus had chalked it up to normal preteen behavior, but something in his gut told him there was more to it. The cafeteria doors were propped open, releasing a wave of noise. Children laughing, plastic trays clattering, and the general chaos of elementary school lunch hour. Marcus scanned the crowded room, looking for his son's familiar face among the sea of students. A group of teachers stood near the lunch line, supervising while chatting among themselves. But Jamal wasn't there. "Excuse me," Marcus stopped a young boy wearing the same grade-level wristband as Jamal. "Do you know Jamal Thompson?" "Yeah," the boy nodded, shifting his lunch tray from one hand to the other. "He's in Mrs. Kensington's class. I think he had to finish some work during lunch today, again." Something in the way the boy said "again" made Marcus's parental instincts tingle. "Does that happen a lot?" The boy looked uncomfortable now, glancing toward his friends waiting at a nearby table. "Kind of. Mrs. Kensington says he needs extra help, but Jamal's really smart. Everyone knows that." Without waiting for more questions, the boy hurried away. Marcus stood still for a moment, processing this information. Jamal had never mentioned staying in during lunch. In fact, he'd specifically talked about playing basketball with his friends during lunch break. The contradiction made Marcus's chest tight with worry. Following the room numbers, he made his way to Mrs. Kensington's classroom. The hallway was quiet now, most students either in the cafeteria or outside for recess. As he approached room 507, he could hear a woman's voice through the partly open door. Her tone was sharp, unlike the warm, encouraging voices Marcus remembered from his own better teachers. He slowed his steps, years of security work teaching him the value of careful observation. Through the narrow window in the door, he could see a portion of the classroom. Several students sat in a small group, but one desk was pushed away from the others. Even from this angle, Marcus recognized his son's slumped shoulders. Standing there in the empty hallway, lunch hour ticking away, Marcus Thompson had no idea that his surprise visit was about to uncover something far more serious than missed family time. As he reached for the door handle, he was simply a father wanting to see his son. He didn't know that in the next hour, he would make a decision that would change not just Jamal's life, but the lives of many children to come. Marcus's hand froze on the door handle as Mrs. Kensington's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Jamal Thompson, that's the third time I've caught you looking at someone else's paper. Move your desk to the corner right now." Through the classroom window, Marcus watched his son carefully. Jamal wasn't even holding a paper. He had been helping the girl next to him pick up pencils she dropped. The other students in the class exchanged knowing looks, but kept their heads down. Standing in the hallway, Marcus decided to observe for a few minutes before entering. His years working security had taught him the value of gathering evidence before acting. He pulled out his phone and quietly started recording through the window, making sure to capture the time and date. Mrs. Kensington was a tall woman with steel gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. She walked between the desks like a guard patrolling a prison yard, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. When she passed white students whispering and sharing erasers, she smiled and moved on. But when she reached Jamal's new spot in the corner, she stopped and crossed her arms. "I don't see you working, Mr. Thompson," she said loudly enough for the whole class to hear. "Maybe you'd rather spend tomorrow's recess finishing this assignment?" Jamal's voice was so quiet Marcus could barely hear it. "I finished it, Mrs. Kensington. It's on your desk." "Don't talk back to me," she snapped, walking to her desk. She picked up a paper, Jamal's completed work, and made a show of looking it over. "Well, these answers are clearly copied. You'll have to do it again." Marcus watched his son's shoulders tense, but Jamal kept his composure. "I didn't copy, Mrs. Kensington. I can explain how I got each answer." A boy with blonde hair raised his hand. "Mrs. Kensington, Jamal's telling the truth. He helped me understand the math yesterday. He's really good at." "That's enough, Tyler," Mrs. Kensington cut him off. "It's nice that you want to help your classmate, but I've been teaching for 30 years. I know copy work when I see it." Marcus felt his blood pressure rising as he continued recording. He watched Mrs. Kensington walk to her desk and pull out a fresh worksheet. She slapped it down on Jamal's desk, making several students jump. "Start over," she commanded. "And this time, do your own work." A small girl with braids timidly raised her hand. "Mrs. Kensington, it's lunchtime. Shouldn't we all go to the cafeteria?" Mrs. Kensington checked her watch. "Yes, everyone except Jamal may go to lunch. He needs to learn that actions have consequences." As the other students reluctantly packed up their things, Marcus saw several of them give Jamal sympathetic looks. One boy tried to leave his lunch bag on Jamal's desk, but Mrs. Kensington quickly intercepted it. "No sharing food, Michael. Jamal can eat when he finishes his work correctly." The students filed out, leaving Jamal alone with Mrs. Kensington. Marcus watched as his son pulled out a pencil with trembling hands and started working on the new sheet. Mrs. Kensington sat at her desk, occasionally making disapproving noises as she graded papers. 5 minutes passed. 10. Jamal worked steadily, but Marcus could see the tension in his son's body. This wasn't the confident, happy boy who left home that morning. This was someone who had learned to make himself small, to try to disappear. Through the window, Marcus noticed details that made his stomach turn. The way Jamal flinched whenever Mrs. Kensington stood up. The way he rubbed his stomach, probably hungry, since he hadn't eaten since breakfast. The way his eyes kept darting to the door, maybe hoping his father would somehow know to come rescue him. When Jamal finished the second worksheet and brought it to Mrs. Kensington's desk, she barely looked at it before ripping it in half. "Sloppy work," she declared. "Start again." That was when Marcus saw something break in his son's eyes. A single tear rolled down Jamal's cheek as he walked back to his desk, but he quickly wiped it away. Mrs. Kensington smirked, and in that moment, Marcus understood that this wasn't about schoolwork at all. His hands shaking with anger, Marcus checked his phone. He had captured 17 minutes of clear evidence. 17 minutes that showed a pattern of targeted harassment no child should ever experience. 17 minutes that proved what was happening in room 507 wasn't education, it was abuse. Taking a deep breath, Marcus put his phone away and reached for the door handle again. This time, he had no intention of just watching. Before Marcus could open the door, Mrs. Kensington's voice rang out again. "Class, get into groups of 4 for the science project." She paused, looking directly at Jamal. "Except you, Mr. Thompson. You'll work alone since you can't seem to behave properly in groups." Marcus watched as the students reluctantly shuffled into groups, their eyes darting between Jamal and their teacher. His son sat alone at his desk in the corner, clutching his science textbook so tightly his knuckles turned white. The classroom felt heavy with unspoken words and uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Kensington, a girl with glasses, spoke up. We only have 3 people in our group. Can Jamal join us? The teacher's face hardened. Sarah, I've already explained that Jamal needs to learn about consequences. Besides, he's disruptive in groups. Marcus saw several students exchange knowing looks. A boy in the back raised his hand halfway, then lowered it after receiving warning glances from his classmates. It was clear this wasn't the first time they had witnessed such treatment. From his position at the door, Marcus could see his son's face clearly now. Jamal was fighting back tears, but his jaw was set in determination. He opened his textbook and started working, trying to appear unbothered. But Marcus noticed how his son's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The other students began their project, discussing which plants grew better in sunlight versus shade. Their voices were hushed, as if speaking too loudly might draw Mrs. Kensington's attention. Every few minutes, someone would glance at Jamal, their faces showing a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Remember, Mrs. Kensington announced, walking between the groups, you'll be presenting your findings tomorrow. Well, except for Jamal, who will submit a written report instead. We wouldn't want him disturbing the class presentations, would we? A few students shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Sarah, the girl with glasses, looked like she might cry. Marcus noticed a boy named Tyler writing something on a piece of paper, trying to secretly pass it to Jamal. Mrs. Kensington swooped down like a hawk, snatching the paper before it reached its target. What's this? She asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She unfolded the note and read it aloud. Don't worry, you're the smartest kid in class. This isn't fair. The teacher crumpled the paper and dropped it in the trash. Tyler, since you're so concerned about fairness, you can join Jamal in working alone. Move your desk to the other corner. Tyler started gathering his books, but Jamal spoke up. Please, Mrs. Kensington, don't punish Tyler. He was just being nice. Being nice? Mrs. Kensington's voice rose sharply. You call disrupting my classroom being nice? You call encouraging defiance being nice? She walked to Jamal's desk and leaned down, her face inches from his. This is exactly why you can't work in groups. You're a troublemaker, Mr. Thompson, just like your father probably was. Outside the classroom, Marcus felt his whole body go rigid with anger. The phone in his hand was still recording, capturing every word of this cruel exchange. He watched as his son, his brilliant, kind-hearted boy, tried to make himself smaller in his chair. But something unexpected happened next. Jamal slowly sat up straighter, looked Mrs. Kensington in the eye, and spoke in a clear, steady voice. My father is a good man who works 2 jobs to take care of me. He taught me to stand up to bullies, even when they're adults. The classroom fell completely silent. Mrs. Kensington's face turned red with rage. She grabbed Jamal's science textbook off his desk and slammed it onto her own. That's it. Since you want to be disrespectful, you can spend the rest of the day in the principal's office. And don't expect to get this book back. You'll have to explain to your father why he needs to buy you a new one. That was the breaking point. Marcus had seen enough. His son's brave words, spoken in defense of him, had filled his heart with pride and pain in equal measure. He stopped the recording on his phone and took out another device, his work phone. With hands that were surprisingly steady despite his anger, he dialed 3 numbers, 911. As he waited for the call to connect, Marcus watched his son gather his things with dignity, despite the tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. In that moment, Marcus knew that calling the police wasn't just about protecting Jamal. It was about protecting every child who had ever sat in Mrs. Kensington's classroom feeling small, afraid, and alone. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's calm voice came through Marcus's phone as he stood in the hallway, his eyes still fixed on his son through the classroom window. Marcus spoke quietly but firmly. I'm at Riverside Elementary School, and I need to report a teacher who's actively discriminating against and emotionally abusing students. I have video evidence of the last 20 minutes, and I'm watching it continue right now. The operator took down the school's address while Marcus explained the situation. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Kensington was now going through Jamal's backpack, pulling out his notebooks and placing them on her desk one by one. These assignments are clearly too advanced for you, she announced loudly. I think you've been cheating all semester. I'll need to speak with your father about getting you moved to a lower-level class. Marcus's grip tightened on his phone as he told the 911 operator, "The teacher is now confiscating my son's personal property. She's targeting him because of his race, denying him lunch, and attempting to sabotage his academic record." Through the window, he could see other students watching in horror as Mrs. Kensington emptied Jamal's backpack. A small lunchbox fell out, the one Marcus had packed that morning with Jamal's favorite sandwich and fruit. "And what's this?" Mrs. Kensington picked up the lunchbox with 2 fingers as if it were dirty. "I thought I said no lunch until you complete your work correctly." She walked to the trash can and held the lunchbox over it. "Please." Jamal's voice cracked. "My dad wakes up early to make my lunch every day." Several students stood up from their desks, but Mrs. Kensington's sharp glare made them sit back down. The lunchbox dangled over the trash can. "Officers are on their way," the operator assured Marcus. "Would you like to stay on the line?" Marcus watched as Mrs. Kensington dropped the lunchbox into the trash. Something deep inside him, some last thread of patience, snapped. "No," he told the operator. "I need to get my son out of that classroom right now. The officers can meet me inside." Ending the call, Marcus took a deep breath and thought about what his own father had taught him about facing injustice. "Stand tall," his father had said, "but stay calm. Your dignity is your strongest weapon." Inside the classroom, Mrs. Kensington was writing something in a thick folder labeled with Jamal's name. "I'm documenting your behavioral issues," she announced. "By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if any school in this district will take you." Marcus watched his son's face crumble at these words. Jamal, who had dreamed of being a scientist since he was 5 years old, who read advanced math books for fun, who helped younger kids with their homework at the community center, was being threatened with the destruction of his academic future. Other students were now openly crying. Sarah, the girl with glasses, had her hand pressed over her mouth in shock. Tyler was gripping his desk so hard it looked like he might break it. Marcus checked his phone one last time, making sure he had enough storage to continue recording. He had already documented Mrs. Kensington, falsely accusing Jamal of cheating, isolating him from group work, denying him lunch, making discriminatory comments, threatening his academic future, destroying his personal property. He thought about handling this through the school system, filing complaints and attending board meetings. But he had seen too many cases where discrimination was swept under the rug, where children suffered while adults held meetings and wrote reports. No, this needed to stop today, right now. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance strengthened his resolve. Marcus Thompson straightened his warehouse uniform, checked that his visitor's badge was visible, and reached for the classroom door handle one final time. He thought about all the times he had told Jamal to be strong, to work twice as hard, to keep his head high no matter what. Now it was time to show his son that sometimes being strong meant calling out injustice, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it might be. As his hand turned the door handle, Marcus silently promised his son that this would be Mrs. Kensington's last day of teaching. Some people might say calling 911 was too extreme, but watching your child being systematically broken down was too extreme too. Sometimes justice couldn't wait for committees and conferences. Sometimes justice needed to arrive with flashing lights and badges. The door opened, and Marcus Thompson stepped into room 507, ready to show his son what standing up for yourself really looked like. The classroom door opened with a quiet click, but its effect was like a thunderclap. Mrs. Kensington spun around, her face changing from anger to surprise as Marcus stepped into the room. Jamal's eyes went wide, a mix of relief and worry crossing his face. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Kensington's voice switched to a sugary sweetness that fooled no one. "We don't allow parents to interrupt class time without an appointment." Marcus walked calmly to the trash can and retrieved his son's lunchbox. "And teachers aren't allowed to deny children food as punishment," he said, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. The sound of sirens grew louder outside. Mrs. Kensington's fake smile faltered. "I'm handling a disciplinary issue with your son. If you'd like to schedule a parent-teacher conference." "I've been watching through that window for the past 30 minutes. Marcus cut her off, holding up his phone. "I've recorded everything. The false accusations, the isolation, the discrimination." The other students sat frozen in their seats, eyes moving back and forth between Marcus and their teacher like they were watching a tennis match. Sarah, The girl with glasses suddenly raised her hand. I want to tell what happened yesterday, too, she said, her voice shaking but determined. When Mrs. Kensington made Jamal stand in the hallway for an hour because she said he was cheating on the test. He got the highest score in class because he studied hard, not because he cheated. Before Mrs. Kensington could respond, the classroom door burst open again. Principal Roberts rushed in, followed by 2 police officers. The principal's face was flushed, either from running or from embarrassment at having law enforcement in his school. What's going on here? Principal Roberts demanded, looking between Marcus and Mrs. Kensington. Show them the video, Tyler called out from his desk. Show them everything. Other students began speaking up all at once. She always picks on Jamal. She throws away his lunch. She tells him he's not smart enough to be here. She makes him sit alone every day. Mrs. Kensington's face had turned chalk white. These children are lying. I'm a respected teacher with 30 years of experience. One of the police officers, a tall woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. Sir, she addressed Marcus, you reported witnessing ongoing discrimination and abuse. Marcus nodded and pulled up the video on his phone. I recorded everything I saw today, but this has been going on much longer. He turned to the class. Would any of you be willing to tell the officers what you've seen? Hands shot up across the room. Even students who had stayed quiet before were now ready to speak. The second police officer began taking notes as children shared story after story. Principal Roberts looked like he might be sick. Mrs. Kensington, please gather your things and come to my office immediately. He turned to the class. Students, Ms. Johnson from next door will supervise you while we sort this out. But Jamal stood up from his isolated desk in the corner. Dad, his voice was small but steady, can I say something first? Marcus nodded encouragingly, and the officers turned their attention to Jamal. Mrs. Kensington, Jamal looked directly at his teacher. Every day you told me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough, wasn't worth enough. But my dad taught me that nobody can make you feel worthless unless you let them. He picked up his backpack and walked to stand beside his father. I'm not letting you anymore. The classroom erupted in applause. Several students jumped up to hug Jamal. Mrs. Kensington, her face now red with humiliation, was escorted out by Principal Roberts. The female officer knelt down to Jamal's eye level. That was very brave, she said. Would you and your dad be willing to come down to the station to make a formal statement? We take discrimination cases very seriously. As Marcus watched his son nod bravely, he felt a mix of pride and sadness. Proud that Jamal had found his voice, sad that he had to use it in this way. But looking around at the supportive faces of Jamal's classmates, he knew that today's events would create ripples far beyond room 507. Miss Johnson arrived to take over the class, and as Marcus prepared to leave with Jamal and the officers, students called out, See you tomorrow, Jamal. We got your back. You're the bravest kid in school. Walking down the hallway, Marcus kept his hand on his son's shoulder. They had a long afternoon ahead of them, but they would face it together. Sometimes, he thought, the most important lessons learned in school had nothing to do with textbooks at all. After giving their statements at the police station, Marcus and Jamal sat in their old pickup truck in the parking lot. Neither had spoken much during the 2 hours of questioning. Now, in the privacy of their vehicle, the emotions they'd both been holding back started to surface. Can we get ice cream? Jamal asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. It was something they used to do when he was younger, after bad days or difficult moments. Marcus started the truck. Of course, son. Rocky Road, right? 10 minutes later, they sat at their favorite spot in Wilson Park, a wooden bench overlooking the duck pond. Jamal's ice cream was melting faster than he could eat it, dripping onto his school uniform, but for once, Marcus didn't mind the mess. How long? Marcus finally asked, watching a family of ducks swim by. How long has she been treating you like that? Jamal stared at his ice cream cone. Since the first day of school. When I answered all her math questions correctly, she accused me of looking at someone else's paper. He paused, taking a shaky breath. She said there was no way I could be that smart. Marcus felt his heart break a little more. He remembered his own school days, being the only black kid in advanced classes, having to prove himself over and over again. He had hoped things would be different for his son. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus asked gently, though he already knew the answer. Because you work so hard, Jamal's voice cracked. 2 jobs, and you're always tired, but you never complain. You make my lunch every morning and help with my homework every night. Tears started falling onto his ice cream cone. I didn't want to give you one more thing to worry about. Marcus pulled his son close, not caring that the melting ice cream was getting on his warehouse uniform. Listen to me, Jamal. You are never, ever a burden. Your problems are my problems. We're a team, remember? Jamal nodded against his father's shoulder, finally letting out the sobs he'd been holding back for months. She made me feel so small, Dad. Like nothing I did was ever good enough. Like I didn't deserve to be in that class. Marcus held his son tighter, remembering all the small signs he'd missed. Jamal's sudden quiet at dinner when school was mentioned. The mysterious stomach aches on Monday mornings. The way he'd stopped talking about his dreams of becoming a scientist. I'm sorry, Marcus whispered. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. But I'm proud of you, son, so proud. You stayed strong, you kept working hard, and when the moment came, you stood up and told the truth. Jamal pulled back, wiping his eyes. Like you did. You weren't afraid of Mrs. Kensington or the principal or anyone. Oh, I was afraid, Marcus admitted, surprising his son. But sometimes being brave means doing what's right even when you're scared. And nothing scares me more than seeing someone hurt my boy. They sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks and finishing what was left of their ice cream. A police car drove by slowly, and the officer inside waved. Jamal waved back. What happens now? Jamal asked. Do I have to go back to school tomorrow? Marcus shook his head. The principal called while you were giving your statement. They're putting Mrs. Kensington on immediate leave and investigating every complaint against her. You'll have a substitute teacher for now. What if the other kids think I'm a snitch? You saw how they stood up for you today, Marcus reminded him. Sometimes being brave gives other people courage too. Your classmates were just waiting for someone to speak up first. Jamal nodded slowly, then reached into his backpack and pulled out his science notebook, the one Mrs. Kensington had tried to take away. Dad, can we do some experiments when we get home? I still want to be a scientist. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, but he smiled. Absolutely, we can do all the experiments you want. He checked his watch. I should call work. Let them know I won't make it to my evening shift. But Dad, we need the money. Hey, Marcus cut him off gently. Some things are more important than money. Tonight, it's just you and me, some science experiments, and maybe even pizza for dinner. Deal? Jamal's smile, his real smile, the one Marcus hadn't seen in months, finally returned. Deal. As they walked back to the truck, Marcus kept his arm around his son's shoulders. They had more challenges ahead, but they would face them together. Sometimes healing started with ice cream, science experiments, and the simple truth that a father's love was stronger than any bully's hate. The next 3 weeks passed like a whirlwind. Marcus's phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from parents, reporters, and school district officials. Word had spread quickly about what happened in room 507, and it seemed everyone had a story to tell. On a Tuesday morning, Marcus sat in a large conference room at the district office. Around the table sat Principal Roberts, 3 school board members, 2 civil rights attorneys, and a representative from the Department of Education. Papers and folders covered the entire table. Mr. Thompson, the lead investigator, Mrs. Chen, spoke while reviewing her notes. Since your video went public, we've received complaints from 27 former students of Mrs. Kensington. Some of these cases go back 15 years. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, and nobody did anything about it. Principal Roberts shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There were informal complaints, but Mrs. Kensington always had an explanation. Her experience and test scores seemed to support her methods. Test scores? Marcus's voice rose slightly. My son cried himself to sleep for months. How many other children did the same? One of the attorneys, Ms. Peterson, opened a thick folder. We've interviewed 18 families so far. The pattern is clear. Mrs. Kensington consistently targeted minority students, especially those showing high academic potential. She pulled out several papers. She would accuse them of cheating, isolate them from group activities, and find reasons to lower their grades. Many students eventually transferred out or dropped to lower-level classes just to escape her classroom. Principal Roberts looked like he might be sick. I should have seen it. The transfer requests, the parent complaints, the students who suddenly started struggling. I failed these children. Yes, you did, Marcus said firmly. But now you have a chance to make it right. Mrs. Chen nodded. We're not just investigating Mrs. Kensington. We're reviewing every discrimination complaint filed in this district over the past 20 years. The patterns we're finding are concerning. She pushed a document across the table. It showed how minority students were much more likely to be disciplined, much less likely to be recommended for advanced classes, and rarely selected for special programs, even when their test scores were higher than their white classmates. Your video didn't just expose one teacher, Miss Peterson explained. It cracked open a door that too many people wanted to keep shut. As if to prove her point, the door opened and Sarah's mother, Mrs. Garcia, walked in. She had become one of the most vocal parents since the incident, organizing other families to share their stories. Sorry I'm late, she said, sitting next to Marcus. I was just meeting with 3 more families. Their children were in Mrs. Kensington's class last year. They want to add their statements to the investigation. The school board members exchanged worried looks. One of them, an older man named Mr. Williams, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss a quiet resolution to this matter. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, but before he could speak, Mrs. Garcia slammed her hand on the table. Quiet? Like how our children had to be quiet while that woman destroyed their confidence. Like how the school was quiet when parents complained. No more quiet. The room fell silent. Mrs. Chen smiled slightly and made another note in her file. The Department of Education agrees, she said. This investigation will be thorough and public. We're implementing immediate changes, including mandatory bias training for all staff, regular classroom observations, and a new system for handling discrimination complaints. Principal Roberts raised his hand like a student. What about the students who were forced out of advanced classes, or the ones whose grades were unfairly lowered? Their records will be reviewed and corrected, Ms. Peterson assured him. And we're establishing a special academic support program to help affected students rebuild their confidence and skills. Marcus thought about Jamal, who was now thriving in his new classroom. His son's story had opened a floodgate, giving other families the courage to come forward with their own experiences. As the meeting continued, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Jamal. Dad, I got an A+ on my science project. My new teacher says I should enter it in the district science fair. Looking around the conference room, at all these people finally working to fix a broken system, Marcus felt hope rising. Sometimes it took one brave moment, one parent refusing to be quiet, one child standing up to injustice, to start a change that would help countless others. The investigation wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time, Marcus believed that real change was possible. Not just for Jamal, but for every child who deserved a chance to learn without fear, to succeed without barriers, to shine without someone trying to dim their light. 3 months after that fateful day in room 507, Marcus sat in the school auditorium, watching Jamal adjust his tie before stepping up to the podium. The room was packed with students, parents, teachers, and news cameras. This was the first district-wide meeting about the new anti-discrimination policies, and Jamal had been asked to speak. My hands are shaking, Jamal had whispered to his father backstage. That's okay, Marcus had replied. Remember what we talked about. Your story might help another kid find their voice. Now, looking at his son standing tall at the podium, Marcus could hardly believe this was the same boy who had once tried to hide his tears in Mrs. Kensington's classroom. Jamal cleared his throat and began to speak. 3 months ago, I was afraid to come to school. Jamal's voice started soft but grew stronger with each word. I thought being smart was something I had to apologize for. I thought being different was something wrong with me. In the audience, several former students of Mrs. Kensington nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes. The investigation had found over 50 cases of discrimination spanning 2 decades. But my father taught me something important, Jamal continued. He taught me that silence helps the wrong people. That speaking up isn't just about helping yourself, it's about helping everyone who comes after you. Marcus watched as Sarah, now president of the new student advocacy group, gave Jamal a thumbs up from her seat. The group had already grown to over 100 members across 5 schools, giving students a safe place to report problems and support each other. Today, things are different, Jamal smiled. My new teacher, Ms. Martinez, doesn't just teach science. She makes sure every student feels valued. When I solve a hard problem, she doesn't accuse me of cheating. She asks me to help teach others. Principal Roberts, sitting on stage, looked both proud and ashamed. The investigation had cost him his job, but he had chosen to stay on as a consultant, helping other schools identify and address discrimination. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the best redemption came from admitting your mistakes and working to fix them. But the biggest change, Jamal said, is that we're not afraid anymore. Every classroom now has a box where students can report problems anonymously. Every teacher has to take special training. And every month, students and parents meet with the school board to make sure these changes stick. In the back of the auditorium, Mrs. Chen from the Department of Education was nodding. The new policies she helped create were being adopted by other school districts across the state. What started in one classroom was spreading like ripples in a pond. My father didn't just stand up for me that day. Jamal's voice cracked slightly. He stood up for every kid who ever felt small, every parent who wasn't listened to, every person who knew something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. Marcus felt tears in his eyes as Jamal turned to look directly at him. Some people said calling 911 was too extreme, but when justice can't wait, sometimes you need to make a lot of noise. Sometimes you need to shine a light so bright that nobody can pretend they don't see the problem anymore. The audience erupted in applause. Students stood up, parents cheered, and even some teachers were crying. Sarah and her advocacy group held up signs reading "Speak Up, Stand Tall, and Education Without Discrimination." After the ceremony, as people gathered in small groups to talk, Marcus watched Jamal surrounded by younger students asking for his advice. His son was different now, stronger, more confident, but also more compassionate. He had learned that standing up for yourself meant standing up for others too. Mr. Thompson, a small voice caught his attention. A young boy, probably first grade, stood nervously beside him. "My teacher is like Mrs. Kensington. Can you help me tell my parents what to do?" Marcus knelt down to the boy's level, feeling the weight of responsibility and hope in this simple request. "Of course I'll help. That's what we do now, we help each other." Looking around the auditorium, at all the lives changed and voices found, Marcus realized that the true victory wasn't just in stopping one teacher's discrimination. It was in creating a community where speaking up was normal, where helping others was expected, and where every child knew they had people fighting for their right to learn and grow without fear. The journey wasn't over. Change never really is. But as Marcus watched his son helping that young boy write down his story, he knew that the light they had sparked would keep burning, pass from hand to hand, making the world a little brighter with each new voice that rose to say, "No more."